glad that you all came. This is really a presentation about the fresh waterways. Fresh waterways is probably one of our bigger issues that we have within our city, just because we have a lot of fresh waterways. I really appreciate all the work the Fresh Waterways group has done to make it work. Our city council is right now working on the budget process, and we have put money into the budget to work on our fresh waterways, but we don't have any hard solutions. There's going to be a lot of things that we need to work on. Part of what Doug's going to present today, and then other studies that we've got going on, will probably help us find our way of where we need to do. But there's no simple solutions, and that's a lot better. Sorry about that. So hopefully you got the gist that the fresh waterways is something very important to us, and we have a tremendous amount of volunteers that work on the fresh waterways, and I really appreciate the job they do. And it's a partnership between the city and the volunteers. To find solutions are going to be a little bit more difficult because we are unique. I mean, obviously our fresh waterways are not natural. They're man-made, and that creates areas that we struggle with. And so we're always looking at finding solutions, and that I would like to thank Steve and the work that he's done with it. It's a tireless task trying to keep everything going. And if you haven't been involved with that organization and are interested in the waterways, I would strongly encourage you to do that. We'll have plenty of conversations going forward on what our possible solutions for the fresh waterways are, and we will probably be enlisting outside experts to help us guide the way. But it's something that just hasn't happened. It's ongoing situations, but then also in talking to other cities that have lakes, they've got some similar problems that we have too. So again, I think it's an education, and having them present today, I think will at least start the talking points. So Steve?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Borba. I am the chair of the Fresh Waterways Advisory Board. Also present here is Bruce Malloy. He is the president of the Fresh Waterways Corporation. Just real quick, those are two different entities. The advisory board is a city board, much like the Parks Board, other boards and commissions, and the Fresh Waterways Corporation is the nonprofit which has been the true mainstay of the fresh waterways since the early 90s. Both of those are volunteers. The board members there's 7 of us at this time. So what we have been working on for really consistently for the last 3 years is working with our contractor, the aquatic biologist, Doug Dorling, which will be up here in just a few moments. And also we have been working with City Council to get funding for one of the things is the Integrated Aquatic Vegetation Management Plan, the IAVMP. And you will hear that will be presented to the city here in a month or 2. So be looking for that. And that will be one where you actually come and you have the presentation and you have feedback on that. Okay, so without further ado, Doug Dorling, he's from Northwest Aquatic Ecosystems, and he is who was contracted by the city to do the weed treatment for this year. Doug?
Hello. Okay. My name is Doug Dorling, and I represent Northwest Aquatic Ecosystems. We are an environmental consulting firm that specializes in lake management. We've been doing this now for about 40 years. Specifically with Ocean Shores, we've probably been out at Ocean Shores for the last 15 or 20 years. So we're pretty much accustomed to what is going on within that waterway system and what should or shouldn't be done to improve it. What I like to do is, every time I give one of these presentations, I think it's important to get a little bit of the past history so that everybody knows what has happened in the past. and what could possibly be happening in the future. Bruce Malloy came across this picture, and we put this in this presentation just last night. And what it is it's the dredging of Duck Lake. The picture on the top is what Duck Lake looked like before the dredging occurred back in 1960, and then when the final dredging was completed back in 1979. But if you look at that dredging equipment they're using in that photograph, you can tell it's old school. But, you know, the other thing we want to talk about is the timeline. I mean, what's transpired with Ocean Shores over the last 20 years, 25 years? So we go back and we look through the records and we find out that algae issues first became apparent on Ocean Shores back in 1970. In 1980, there's a consultant that recommended sewering, put sewers around the lake. 1991, the Fresh Waterways Committee was formed. And 1994 was the KCM study. Now this study here is really a study that provides the most data concerning the waterways. And what it is it is a fairly large document. Consisting of 2 volumes. This is a 1-year study. I believe this was in the neighborhood of about $250,000. But when we go through this study and we look at what has transpired since the study, we don't really see very many things that changed. The main thing that became of this study was that, number one, KCM recognized that nutrients and nutrient sources within this system are the main problems, and they are creating all the issues associated with this waterway system. So in 1998, the sewers were completed. Now the important aspect of the sewers being completed is that in the KCM report, it's very specific that it states that the sewers are likely to reduce the nutrient levels in the lake and create some of the shortfalls to the algae issues and the weed issues. In other words, we're going to reduce nutrients. They felt that there was maybe some septic system leaking, that type of thing. So they put the sewers in 1998. Typically what happens when after a sewer system is put in, it takes about 2 or 3 years before that actually kicks in. But on Ocean Shores, it never kicked in. We have 2 other projects whereby sewer systems were put in where these lakes had incredible algae problems, and within 2 years the water was crystal clear, and that's associated with the affluent that was associated with the septic systems. But we haven't seen that at Ocean Shores. We haven't seen a change in the algae control, the algae issues. We haven't seen a change in the weed control issues. So although sewers have probably helped it somewhat, it hasn't helped it enough to create an observable difference to the system. So in 2007 and 2009, if you're familiar with Ocean Shores, during these years, prior to 2007, there was an incredible growth of a plant in the lake called Brazilian elodea. And what Brazilian elodea is a noxious weed, non-native noxious weed, and it multiplies very quickly. And within about a 3-year period of time, the plant was so thick in Duck Lake that you couldn't take a boat through it. It was infested in the canals, and trying to recreate through the main lake was basically impossible. You couldn't fish. In fact, people were taking their boats off the lake because they just couldn't use it. So in 2007, 2009, or 2007, the city decided, okay, we've got to take care of this problem. So we went forward with a program that was called the fluoridone treatment. And what it is it's a systemic herbicide that was applied to the lake for 10 weeks. And what it did was it successfully eradicated the Brazilian elodea from not only from the lake, but also canals. As of today, there has been no Brazilian elodea noted in either of those water bodies, either the canals or in the lake, which puts this application, this control project, is probably one of the most successful Brazilian elodea control projects in the state of Washington. I mean, it's absurd to think that there has not been any recourse of the Brazilian elodea in this system, but it isn't there. So in 2010, because of the KCM report was almost 10 years old, it was the need to update that KCM report, not to update the entire report, to update the integrated aquatic vegetation management plan. So what we did is we went back into the KCM report and updated just those portions of the plan so it met state specifications. So that's the plan that is in use right now. And basically what it does is it went through the KCM report and updated all the control techniques. It went through harvesting, it went through herbicide treatments, it went through grass carp, it went through bottom screening, it went through nutrient activation, basically went through every possible control term that was out there. And so then that became part of the Ocean Shores, baseline data. Part of the KCM report requested or suggested that grass carp be planted in the lake. And so in 2009 and 2010, the city did plant quite a few grass carp in the lake. These are triploid fish that they don't reproduce, or we don't think they reproduce, but there are some indications now that maybe some of the grass carp have reproduced. They were put in the lake and in the canals. And the idea was that these fish were going to consume enough weeds that we didn't have to do any weed control chemical. The problem is that the stocking rate that was used at Ocean Shores was very, very low. And the reason it was a low stocking rate is because prior to the stocking of Duck Lake, the state stocked the lake down in southern Washington, which I think was Steel Lake or Stevens Lake, with a lot of grass carp. And basically what happened is these grass carp went in and they ate everything. There were no weeds left in the lake. So the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife said, no, we don't want this to happen at Ocean Shores, so we're going to give you a limited stocking density. So they put the fish in, and they worked in very isolated areas. The problem with the grass carp is they kind of hover in the same area. I mean, it's not like they swim all over the lake or swim all over the canals. They'll find a canal area, and that's where they'll stay. And the reason they do that is because they chop down the very tips of the plant, grow it down to the bottom, and then as that plant regrows, they will keep gnawing at it, eating it, because it's like lettuce. I mean, they're not going to go for the older plants that are real tough and they can't digest it. They go for the younger plants. So they basically stay within certain areas of the lake or the canals. And if you were out on the lake 2 or 3 years after these grass carp are in the lake, you would notice you drive your boat by and you could hear these fish hitting the bottom of your boat. And it was just like boom, 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 boom. And you're looking over in the water and it looked like, dorsal fins all over the place. And these fish are big. They got big. They got to be 2-3 feet long. And they're still in there. There's not as many as there used to be. They die off. But we still got reports of the big fish out in the canals or out in the main lake. But it's the grass carp, and they're hard, very big fish. You can't catch them. And eventually the Department of Fish and Wildlife wanted to remove the grass carp from the lake. So what they did is they allowed boat fishermen to come in and kind of fish the grass carp out. And over a couple of 2-3 years period of time, the grass carp population's been reduced, so they really have very little effect on the weed growth right now, or controlling the weed growth. But what we did notice was that what these grass carp did is they didn't eat the milfoil. So all areas around where there was milfoil was clear, but the milfoil plants were still in the lake, which was not a positive, that was a negative. But we really were kind of hoping that we'd get a little bit more control with the grass carp. The other issue that's pretty typical with grass carp is that these are like eating machines. And what you have to imagine is that when you have a fish that's 2-3 feet long, consuming pounds of vegetation a day, everything that goes in one end of the fish eventually comes out the other end of the fish. And over the years, what has been noted is that grass carp increase the phosphorus and nutrient levels within a lake system because they just transpose the nutrients from the vegetation into fecal matter, deposit it back into the lake. So that's was really probably the only downside to the grass carp themselves. Since the grass carp, there were numerous surveys that were done on the lake on a yearly basis. But in 2015 and to the present day, it's been pretty constant treatment in the canals. Not all the canals are treated every year. Certain canals are treated some years, others not. But since 2015, I think there have been yearly treatments to some of the canals within that system. And that's currently where we're at right now, is treating the canals with the entire duck lake system. So, probably one of the most important aspects of the KCM report is that it identified nutrients. Where are all these nutrients coming from? They're spurring the weed growth and algae growth in ocean shores. So what they found out was, if you go over to the Grand Canal, 89% of the nutrients, phosphorus concentration in the canal area is coming from sources that you basically have no control over. They're coming from shallow water groundwater aquifer, they're coming from a deep water groundwater aquifer, and they're coming from the two inlet creeks. So it's nearly impossible to control nutrients entering the lake system from shallow water groundwater, and it's impossible to control nutrient growth entering the lake system from deep water. So these are two avenues that there's basically nothing that can really actually be done. Now on the creeks that are coming into the lake, if you go out and you go out on the Google Maps and you look at the Huda Creek, that drains an area that is just, I consider it a commercial area. I mean, there's a lot of asphalt, there's buildings, there's a lot of parking lot. There's not much area over there for the nutrients to be absorbed or used. So every time it rains, these nutrients basically flow into Huda Creek, and they end up into the system itself. Now, Duck Lake, it's a little bit different, and the numbers are still high, 77%. But again, these are all sources that you really don't have any control over. And if you go through the KCM report, one of the things they notice when you start talking about shallow groundwater nutrients, the first thing I look at ocean shores is the wildlife. I mean, one of the things that people come to ocean shores for to live at is for the wildlife. They love the raccoons. They love the deer swimming around in the water, eating their vegetable gardens. What you have to realize is that, they got to dispose of their waste somewhere. And it's right on the top of all the sand, all the ground. So when it rains, those nutrients sink right through the sand, right into the canal system. So really, the only way to try and reduce, introduction of nutrients from the shallow groundwater is you can't put diapers on these animals. I mean, you have to live with it, and that's one of the one reason why you live at ocean shores is you like the wildlife, and obviously you're not going to do away with the wildlife. So the result of excessive wildlife is excessive nutrients into the lake system. Okay. One of the other things that is responsible for nutrients is, we call it cultural eutrophication. And eutrophication is a really impressive word. It means the aging of the lake system. from when it's very healthy to the time it turns back into a bog. Cultural eutrophication is the response of the lake system to development. Obviously, the more development you have on the lake, the more nutrients are going to enter the lake, the more eutrophication you're going to get. So we went back out onto the Google Maps. We noted that this is just Lake Menard. Lake Menard in 2020, let's go back to 1990. Lake Menard, that's the bottom, top picture on the left. The Lake Menard and the canal system that enters and exits Lake Menard, there were only 20 homes on it. 20 homes. We go back to, now we move forward to 2020, and that lake that once only supported 20 homes is now supporting 80 homes. So what's happened? We've lost ground cover, so a lot more nutrients are entering the lake. There's more campers that are going into these areas. A lot of these sites on Lake Menard now are also camping sites. So there's not much vegetation on them. So again, what happens? Nutrients, animal nutrient hits the ground, goes through the ground, sand and into the groundwater, and it ends up in Lake Menard. But that's a pretty big increase, within a 30-year period of time. And right now, Lake Menard is, last time we were out, it almost looks like it's almost totally developed. So I imagine there's probably close to 90 or 100 homes on the lake now. And again, this is something you can't control. I mean, obviously, the city wants growth, and growth is just part of the system. Residents have purchased parcels of land out at Ocean Shores. They want to build a home. The city's not going to come in and say, no, you can't do this. But it does have an impact on the system. Okay, so one of the things we do almost every year when we come out to look at the lake system is we survey it. And years ago, how did we survey lakes? Years ago, we would take out a GPS unit, we'd go around the lake, we'd throw a rake over the side of the boat, we'd pull the rake in, we'd notice what weeds are on, and we'd make a data point, put it on the map, and we'd probably have thousands of these. And then when you're done, you would go back, you would process all this data, and you come up with a map. But it was a long, very cumbersome process. And it really wasn't very accurate because the only weeds or data that you were collecting was from the exact data points. If you were taking data points every 100 feet apart, you didn't know what was happening in between those 100 feet of data points. So what happened is about 10 years ago, it was new technology was brought out in the market, and it was called electronic. We use electronics now. So what happens is you put a transducer down into the lake. It basically takes a picture of the bottom of the lake. So the picture on the top right is a picture of the lake. Now the yellow line is, turn this on here. This line here is the bottom of the lake here. This yellow line here is the bottom of the lake. And so you see above this, there's nothing, which means there's no weed growth. So this next picture shows the lake bottom, but here we've got a lot of weed growth. And so what happens is all this data is processed, we send it out, and then we get a final map that looks like, oh no, we don't. In order to get the data, I mean, we have to make transects across the lake, up and down the canals. And, so you take these transects about every 100 feet apart, and then you encompass the entire lake, and that's the data that you use. Now, anyway, so what happens is that you end up getting a picture of the bottom of the lake that's color-coded. And all these green areas here are areas that constitute 50% weed cover. This one little red area up here is 100% weed cover, which probably means that the weeds are up to the surface. And the blue area is an area where there are no weeds. So in this particular section of the canals, there's quite a few weeds in it. So what we did was, we go out, we've taken these surveys, and these are the results for some of the areas of the lake. This is the Fishhook Canal. This is Lake Menard. I believe this is a section of the Grand Canal from Ocean View Way all the way up to this Albatross up here. And this is Bass Canal. So you can see in this canal here, there's virtually very little, if any, canal area that does not have a weed infestation problem. And when you look at this, Mary here, it's about 50%. And you also have to realize that these surveys are usually done in May. And the water temperature is a little cooler. So I imagine a lot of these green areas, by the time end of June rolls around, you're probably looking at yellow, orange areas for weed growth. All right. So what we do is we get all this data together, we get the maps together, and we submit it to the advisory committee and the Waterways committee, and they look at the data. We make recommendations as to what we feel should be treated, and then they make the final recommendation as to what will be treated. So in 2002, all these red areas are areas that were treated. Now you're going to notice there's two small canals, I call them the bell canals right here, that weren't treated. We'll talk about that a little later, but those are the two canals where we were going to try and do a harvesting demonstration project. So those areas were not treated specifically so we could harvest those areas. Okay. One thing that we noticed, and when we go through a lot of this, is that the same areas of the canal are basically treated every year. So we go back to 2018. These red areas are the areas of the canal that were treated back in 2018. And here's the treatment for 2022, this year. Basically almost the same areas. Now one of the potential reasons why more of this canal wasn't treated is because of budget. Basically what happens is a budget is established and we set priorities. Which areas of the canal or the lake system are the worst, and those are the ones we treat first, and as the funds run out, those areas aren't treated. So basically, the same areas are somewhat treated every single year. So before we start treating, there's a long, lengthy process. There's a mailing that has to go out to all the property owners, and that's the notice up on the top. This year, I think we mailed out like 2,500 notices to the property owners. We use a mailing list that the city has provided us. In this notice, and it's pretty vague, we get a lot of calls about, oh, this is a pretty vague notice, It says you're going to treat the lake and you give us like a 2-week period of time or 3-week period of time. We've got to be a little more precise. We really can't do that on this notice because we don't know what the weather's going to be like. This notice is sent out 3 weeks before we treat. If there's anybody that can predict what the weather in Ocean Shores is going to be for 5 days in a row, sometime in June, Channel 4 Como Weather Department has a job for you because it's impossible. So we put a very vague date out there, hoping that as the day gets closer and closer, we can kind of zoom in on a specific timeline and the weather forecast. And then we hope that there will be, we have it on our website. The city, I think, publishes it on their website when we start getting close to the treatment date, so the residents are aware of what's going on. The other thing that's done is, for this particular treatment, we put an ad in the newspaper, so residents are aware that something is going to happen. Again, it's pretty vague. but at least they're aware of the fact that, you know, the lake is going to be treated. We don't know exactly when. We know approximately when it's going to be treated, but we don't know exactly when it's going to be treated. So then the day we treat, we put this notice up, and I'm pretty sure everybody's familiar with this notice. This is the notice that's stuck on the docks or on your tree on your property. They're stuck on every single parcel on the canal. And I think that's like maybe, there's 2 signs on each parcel. I think there was like 5,000 or 6,000 signs that were put up. And it takes about 2 days to put these notices up. Now the permit is there are a lot of gray areas in the permit, but there are some very strict areas in the permit. One of the areas has to do with this posting. We can't put up posting signs more than 2 days prior to a treatment. So once we decide we're going to treat, it's get out to Ocean Shores and start stapling. If we pick a treatment date and then we get monsoon rains or winds, we still have to treat. Because in order for us to treat again, we have to go back, take all the old signs down, and put up new signs. So it's a problem. On most lakes, it's not an issue because the lakes, they are large lakes, but they don't have the shoreline configuration as Ocean Shores. And we could post a 320-acre lake such as Silicon Lake in 6 hours. Ocean Shores, which has miles and miles of shoreline, it takes 2 days. So we can change the treatment date on lakes where we know we can post fairly quickly. But on Ocean Shores, once that notice is put out, that's the notice we have to stick with. All right. So what we try to do is, you know, what are the weeds? What are we looking for at Ocean Shores when we treat? We usually have targeted weeds and non-targeted species. So the targeted weeds for 2002 were pondweed, which is a pretty common aquatic plant. There's about 25 different types of pondweeds, and I didn't feel like listing them all, so I just put pondweeds up there. There's a plant out there that was first identified in the lake back in 1998, which is called Elodea. And I've got pictures of them down here, a couple slides past. Elodea is a plant that it's the main dominant species in the water system. And then in 2014, the system came up with a plant called parrot feather. Parrot feather is a noxious weed. It's on the state noxious weed list. And it's a very, very difficult plant to control. It basically starts along the shoreline areas and then spreads throughout the whole lake system. There's also a floating plant on the water surface called Azolla. This was first noticed or identified in 2009 by the Department of Ecology. Now, when they were out surveying for the current IAVAMP, this plant came up. There was a concern over the fact that this plant hadn't been documented, and there really wasn't much knowledge about this particular plant, that it was a new species out on the lake. But in reality, it really wasn't. Again, it's been treated since 2009 out on the lake. The reason it was noticed this year is because the growth was earlier in the season. And then we have the milfoil, which has always been not always, but it's been in there for a fairly long period of time. And then the non-targeted species this year was pennywort. That was first noted in 1998. Pennywort's a really strange plant. Again, it's the plant that if you take your boat out on the canals, you're going to notice this is the green plant that's growing out from the shoreline. In the United States, it's not considered a problem. In Canada, it's considered an invasive plant. So that just shows you the two different philosophies in the two different countries. So this is parrot feather. And these are actual pictures at Ocean Shore, so you can see how it hinders the shoreline of the lake. And at the top of the plant almost looks like a fir tree, pine needles. It looks like pine needles. And it's pretty easy to identify. So this year what we did is, the map on the left is we went out and we found all the parrot feather in the canal system. And so what we did is we took the GPS unit out, and we drove around the lake, and every time we saw a parrot feather plant, bingo, we put it into the GPS. And when we got back, we processed the data, and this is the map on the left of what we came up with. This type of monitoring makes it real easy when we go back to treat it, because we just put this data into the chart recorder, we turn the boat on, and the boat goes, and you can see when you're coming up on the plants. Obviously, if you find additional plants, they're added into the map. But it makes the treatment a lot more efficient and quicker. Now, the picture on the bottom right is really where the parrot feather was the greatest concern. And we didn't do GPS data points on this because it was just so thick. And the whole map would just have a bunch of circles on it. So those are the areas that were targeted and where the parrot feather was very, very thick. So how do you treat parrot feather? Basically, it's sprayed. And you start the picture on the far left is basically just surface spraying parrot feather. So that's, again, another reason why weather conditions are so important. We can't spray parrot feather when it's raining. We can't spray parrot feather when the winds are above like 10 miles an hour. Because that spray is not just going to hit the parrot feather, it's probably going to hit your lawn. Picture in the middle is parrot feather that's been sprayed. It's probably 2 or 3 weeks after it's been sprayed and it's dead or dying. Far right picture is parrot feather roots that are dead or dying. But one of the things that is not a positive for parrot feather is that it drifts. It breaks loose and it will drift around and down the canals. So these two pictures here are pictures of very small patches of parrot feather that broke loose, probably from one of those bigger patches, drifting down the canal, and eventually it's going to find itself somewhere along the shoreline, and it's going to start growing and growing and growing. Other plant that we notice out there is duckweed. And again, that's a free-floating plant. It's very small. In fact, the top picture was taken this year in September. You can't see it, but there's a gentleman out there in a bathing suit trying to net the duckweed out. Trying to net all that duckweed out of the water system. These plants reproduce at an incredible pace. I mean, they'll double in size within 2 or 3 days. So you can go out to your area and you can do all the netting you want. If you leave any majority of the plants there within a week, you're going to be looking at that same issue. Duckweed floats all over. I mean, you can wake up one morning and there's no duckweed, and then at 6 o'clock at night when you have a big party going, the duckweed will be there. Because it just floats all over the lake, all over the lake. But it's treatable. Next picture. Now we're looking at, this is the plant called Azolla. This is the fern that's out on the lake. And this is probably just as bad as the duckweed. And the fact that that picture in the upper left, that's in the ocean shores. That's in one of the canals. This plant reproduces a lot quicker than the duckweed does. It has spores, so it's basically really kind of impossible to get rid of it. But it's unique to the fact that it's like a hydroponic garden. If you turn one of these plants over, you'll see it just has a bunch of roots coming down from the bottom of it. And that's how it absorbs all its nutrients right from the water. Okay, so the main plant species on the lake, Aladea, pretty common plant. You can go to any fish store, you'll see them selling it in the fish store. Pretty easy to identify. The problem with it is that it reproduces from fragmentation, which means any boat that passes through it and cuts a piece off, it's going to spread. It's going to go to some other area of the lake, it'll sink to the bottom. Eventually what happens is it's floating, it grows a root off the bottom of the plant, the root gets real heavy and it just sucks it right down to the bottom of the lake. So it's a very, very difficult plant to eradicate, especially in ocean shore. Next. All right, so this is the pennywort that we had treated, but we didn't treat it this year. And you can see the picture up in the upper right is that wetland, way up at the very north end of the canal. Again, there's another picture of it here, aerial in the bottom. But pennywort is although we didn't target it specifically this year, the material that we use to control the submerged weeds also controls pennywort to an extent. What it will do is it will kill the plant back, probably to the shoreline. So you get somewhat seasonal control with the material we use to control the other plants in the lake, but it will come back. The only way to really get rid of it is to use a different type of material. But the material we use seems to do fine. It eliminates a lot of the problems that we've seen in the past with the pennywort. Now this is an interesting little section here. Last year, we went up to the very northern end of the lake, the canal, and we were targeting the pennywort, even though we really weren't supposed to target the pennywort. But when we got up into the northern part of that canal, we noticed parrot feather was up there. So we decided, okay, we're going to treat it. So this is a video. It's about 3 minutes long of driving through that northern part of the canal, treating the lake.
Doesn't want to play without the music or without the noise.
Oh, just played before. Turn the noise back on.
It's a scam.
Okay, so we'll put up a line. If you really want to look at this video, it's because it's kind of neat. What we did was the guy who was driving the boat, he had these glasses on that had cameras on them. And it was very clear. The final results of this work. But anyway, so here's the pennywort after it was treated up in the canal area. You can see it was pretty successful. Again, this was 2021. We didn't target any pennywort up in this area this year. Okay, so, we talked about, spraying, this, that, and the other thing. How do we go about this? Well, we work under what is called an NPDES permit. And it is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit, NPDES. Every water body in the state of Washington, if you are discharging something into it, in order to avoid a Clean Water Act suit, you need to obtain an NPDES permit. So the Department of Ecology has a general statewide NPDES permit for lake treatments. What happens is each individual water body then applies for their own separate permit. And the City of Ocean Shores obtained their permit, probably 10 years ago. And it gets grandfathered in. So you don't have to go through the whole permitting process every single year. It's grandfathered in. The permit runs in 5-year cycles. The current permit is under the 2021 to 2026 cycle. So in 2026 what will happen, this NPDES permit will come for review. It'll be about a 6-month process whereby there'll be public hearings, you'll be able to comment, problems with the permit will be changed, and then a new permit will be issued. And it'll go from 2027 to 2032. And this will just continue until they decide they're not going to use them anymore. Okay, so what materials do we use to treat the weeds? The main material we use is a material called dicot. And dicot controls the elodea, it controls the pond weeds, it controls the duckweed, and it controls the azolla. Now the parafeather, which is along the shoreline, is controlled by other materials called imazapyr and triclopyr. Imazapyr and triclopyr can be used all year round in any lake in the state of Washington. Dicot can only be used year-round in lakes that do not support salmonids, which is duck lake. So we can use this material anytime. One of the questions we always get is, how toxic is dicot? I mean, what's going to happen if I jump in the water? Technically, there are no swimming restrictions when we apply dicot to any water body in the state of Washington. In other words, as soon as we put this material in, you can swim, you can fish. The only thing you can't do is irrigate. The state of Washington basically puts a 24-hour recommendation that you stay out of the water. And that's part of the permit. So that's what we have to tell you. But when you look at the data about dicot, how toxic it is, dicot is way down here. There's dicot. So to determine how toxic a material is called an LD50. And what it is the lethal concentration of the material that will kill 50% of the test organisms. So in other words, what happens is they will continually up the dosage of dicot in a test situation until 50% of the test animals are killed. And then that will be the LD50. So if we look at some of these other LD50s that are out there, nicotine. If you're still smoking, nicotine is more toxic to you than dicot. If you're using this particular drug as a blood pressure medicine, it's more toxic than dicot. Warfarin, which again, it's a blood thinner. It's used a lot in heart conditions. More toxic than dicot. And let's get down to this one, caffeine. Caffeine is more toxic than dicot. Aspirin is not quite as toxic as dicot, but it's close to it. Now, there are a lot of people that drink coffee, and to see an LD50 of this magnitude in comparison to what's put in the water, there should be no concern for the use of dicot in the waterway system, ocean shores. Okay. Okay, so we're getting ready to treat. Obviously, the picture on the left is treating, and this is the posting procedure where the boat, goes up to the dock, puts the signs on the dock, and then moves on to the next site. So if you remember earlier, we talked about the pre-treatment survey. So this is the bell canals or the clamshell canals. This is what the clamshell canals look like before we treated this year. We went back in September and basically took the same survey, and this is what we've seen. So basically prior to the treatment, you're looking at probably 50% weed cover in the bell canals. After treatment, you're basically looking at very, very limited weed growth in the canals. This is a section of the Grand Canal. This is what we want to key in on. This is from the opening of the bell canals up to the cement bridge. This is before, this is after. And you can see the pretty vast difference between the before and after. The nice thing about these maps are they're so easy to evaluate. I mean, you're not looking at numbers, you're not looking at percentages, you're looking at colors. You know, if you got green, you got trouble. If you got blue, you're home free. Okay. All right, so this area here are all those little offshoot canals that are right adjacent to the bell canals. This is before, this is after. So you can see that there is a remarkable difference from before and after treatments. All right, this is Lake Menard. Now this year at Lake Menard, we treated this section of the lake. We treated this section of the lake. And we treated this section of the lake. So we go back, here's Lake Menard in the fall. No weeds, very little weeds. And so this is a picture from the cement bridge up to, I believe it's Albatross. It's the Grand Canal. Green, green, a little bit of blue. Over here, blue. So these are two areas that weren't treated. So let's see how they fared. This is the Bass Canal. This is before, this is after. So you can see before treatment there were no red areas, which is 100% weed cover. There were no yellow areas, and a few green areas. When we get back here, you're probably looking at a considerable increase in those type of conditions. Now this area up here is just north of the wooden bridge, and this is really a hard area to survey because you don't know if the data you're getting is reliable or not because it's so shallow. These transducers have a tendency to reflect data off the bottom differently if you're in real shallow water. In this area, north of the bridge is very shallow. So has there been any progress on anything? We've been telling about all these treatments that have been going on. We went back into the files. Here's a picture of the bell canals in the spring of 2017. Here's a picture of the bell canals in the spring of 2022. Now, there are a lot of different factors and a lot of different variables that could or could not impact this, could or could not impact that. But I think generally from this picture here, you can see that yes, the weed growth has decreased somewhat, at least in the bell canals. Okay, so this year was wanted to do, well, the city wanted to do a harvesting project. And the reason for the harvesting project was they wanted to determine if future harvesting, first of all, was feasible. Second, was it economical? And so we set out on this mission to try and develop a harvesting scheme for ocean shores. It was very late in the season. And what you have to realize is these harvesting operations, a lot of their work is already scheduled months in the springtime, early spring, late winter for the following year. So when we got involved with this in May, when we go to the harvesting people, they say, oh, this is kind of tough, we're kind of booked. I said, well, we'll try to get in. So we went to the next process of, okay, you're going to try and get us in. We're giving you a timeline. Let's see what we have to do in order to make this thing work. So these were the 2 canals that we decided, with the agreement was made that these were the 2 canals that we're going to be harvesting. This canal is about 7 acres. This one is about 9 acres. So you're looking at about 16 acres total. Okay, so when we started looking at this harvesting project, there were a lot of variables that came up because it's so late in the season. When we tried to break it down, we didn't want to put out a very complicated RFP, so it was fairly simple. And what we did is we asked some very simple questions to the contractors. One was availability. When are you available? Are you going to be able to get out to ocean shores sometime in July, or you're going to be out there in August, September? What's your timeline? The crew. I mean, how many people are in your crew? Do you have a 2-person crew? Do you have a 3-person crew? Do you use 2 harvesters? Do you use 1 harvester? Experience is key in harvesting. An experienced harvester can harvest a lot more weeds than somebody that hasn't done it for many years. So we looked at that. And then equipment. Equipment is another really, really strong variable. There are only 2 harvesters in the Pacific Northwest. One is local, located down in Rochester. The other one is in Northern California. And those are the only 2 harvesters that service the Pacific Northwest. So we want to make sure that the equipment that they're using when they get it out here is going to work. It's not going to break. Some of this equipment is pretty old, 15, 20, 25 years old. And when you look at construction equipment that's that old, there typically are problems associated with it. One of the other important factors is spare parts. I mean, what type of spare parts does each contractor maintain? What do they have in their trucks? So that if a hydraulic pump breaks, can they replace it on site? If a hydraulic hose breaks, can they replace it on site? Obviously, they're not going to be able to go to the Ace Hardware down here and pick up a hydraulic pump for a harvester. I mean, that's got to be something they have on site with them. And then, of course, there's the bearings and bushings and all that kind of stuff that we try and make sure that they have spare parts. Another aspect of the harvesting is that the hydraulic oil. Some of these harvesters are 25 years old. And the harvesters that we like to use or see use are harvesters that are used vegetable oil as a hydraulic fluid. So that, excuse me? So if a hose breaks, you're disposing of a vegetable oil into the lake instead of a hydraulic fluid, same type of fluid you would put in a tractor. So we wanted to make sure the contractor had a vegetable type based hydraulic oil. And then we've got expenses. I mean, what are their expenses? Obviously, they're not going to be able to come up here and harvest 15 or 16 acres in a day. These harvesters at the best will take out maybe 1.5 acres of weeds. So they're gonna be up here a week, 2 weeks. So we've got lodging. You've got mobilization, you got mileage, and you got the basic harvesting fee. And that fee ran anywhere from $1,600 to $2,000 per acre per cut. So what's the responsibility of us, the contractor? Our job is to make sure that, number one, when you're paying a contractor $2,000 an acre, you want to make sure that that harvester is out there cutting weeds, that it's not transporting weeds from point A to point B, offloading the weeds without cutting weeds. So we want to make sure that they have their equipment can do that. One of the harvesting companies could do that, the other harvesting company couldn't do that. The other thing we look at as a contractor, we look at staging area. In other words, in these canals, where are we going to stage the equipment? When I mean staging areas, I mean where are we going to be able to back this harvester up, to offload weeds into a truck, and then haul the weeds off to a dump site. Obviously, you want to make that as close as possible to where you're harvesting, so that you're not wasting time traveling to get from point A to point B, not harvesting weeds. And then the other thing is, once we get the weeds off the lake, once we get it in the back of a pickup truck, or not a dump truck, where do they go? Is there a property owner in the area that's willing to put up with tons and tons of weeds on their lot? Or is there a lot available that we can dispose of these weeds and then have the city come in with their equipment and pick them up and just take them away? Okay, so one of the first issue we had to address was back in 2021, there was some talk between one of the contractors and the city about this harvesting. His equipment couldn't access the shoreline to offload, so there was somewhat of a decision made that they would use. Apparently, the city has a access point right here on Lake Menard for kayaks, that type of thing, rowboats. And so this is where the offload route was going to be. So in other words, the harvester was going to have to travel from here, full harvester, down, over. It's about 4,200 feet. Harvester loaded up. Maximum will be able to do 3 miles an hour. So we take that 4,200 feet, figure out how long it's going to take them in the best scenario to get to from point A to point B. We're looking at about 17 to 20 minutes one way. So we get a harvester that's full here. He's done, he comes out here, 20 minutes he's here, 20 minutes he's back here. So within a 1 hour time frame, he's harvested for 20 minutes and he's driven the boat without harvesting for 40 minutes. That doesn't seem to be very cost effective. So we went back out and we looked at this again. What we did was, first of all, we went out on the Google map. And we looked at the aerial pictures. And we located about 20 parcels, a dozen parcels, that we felt were potential staging areas. Obviously, we couldn't tell from the Google Maps if they were good or not. So what we did is we sent somebody out there. They spent a day out there walking around those 2 canals. And it was nice. I mean, I didn't do it, one of the employees did. But what he noticed was there was a lot of helpful people there that they were interested in the project. And they basically kind of helped them out to find out where these sites were and walked them down to some of the sites, and we got tons and tons of pictures of them. But anyway, after this visit, we then went back out on the lake with the boat, drove the canals again to see what the access would be from the water. And we located 3 sites that we felt were accessible and that could be used. So now we have the sites, we think we have the sites. We know they're a short distance, but are we going to have permission to use the sites? Well, one thing, the city has little parks here, little park here, that we would use as the dump site. So then we went to the property owners, and they were excited about it, but there were stipulations. First stipulation was, they really didn't want us harvesting on the weekends, because that's when they would see the most use of the property. And we would have to coordinate with them, because they didn't know what their schedule was going to be like for this year. But they were willing to, allow us to use that property. Because it is, I mean, if you're down there, for the weekend and you've got your family down there, I mean, it's not that you want to have a dump truck in the back of your property, unloading weeds and then taking off, coming back. It's just not good. The other thing we had to look at was reclamation. I mean, after this dump truck is in there and out there, 40 or 50 times, how much damage are we going to do to the lot? So we're going to have to, probably do some reclamation on some of these lots. But so we basically got all those issues ironed out. So then we went back to the contractor. We said, okay, here it is, we're ready to go. We're somewhat ready to go. You ready to go? Well, no, we're not going to be able to get out there until this date. And it was late in the season. It was sometime in August, mid-August, I think it was. And at that point, I think the city called us, or we called the city. There's communication between the city and us saying, is this really worth it to be doing this late in the season? The cost-benefit ratio isn't there. Residents are not going to be using the lake as much in September as they would be in July. So we canceled it. So there was no harvesting done this year on the lake. But the groundwork has been established, so that next year, or this year, 2023, a harvesting project can proceed. There will need to be some minor work done to some of these lots, like removing brush, this, that, and the other thing. But it's not like we're going to have to bring a bulldozer in to bulldoze down this and bulldoze down that. But access on the canals, it's difficult, because you can't just the harvester up to the shoreline. You can back it up, but then you're going to have to unload the weeds right there because of the steepness of the shoreline. So again, the contractor we selected had a conveyor belt. What they do is they would bring the conveyor belt down to the shoreline. So a little bit of slope on the shoreline really didn't make much of a difference. The harvester could sit out a little bit. The weeds are offloaded onto the conveyor belt, right into the back of the dump truck. And then the dump truck goes over to these sites here. They dump it. And then the city at some point in time comes back and picks it up and removes it. Okay. Okay, well, this was the final outcome, basically being that, the timelines just didn't match up. I mean, the harvesting guy, they were very interested in doing it, but we didn't really see a cost-benefit ratio. They were already treating, the reason they were late, they were up treating a lake up in Kitsap County. And they were going to come down and harvest Ocean Shores, go up to Kitsap Lake, harvest Kitsap Lake, come back down and harvest Ocean Shores again. Again, they were late up to Kitsap Lake, they were late harvesting, which pushed everything back. And it just wasn't worth it. So what we did get out of this, though, and this is just really some information that we obtained just talking to the contractors. I mean, none of this work has ever been done, but we definitely know that the cost of harvesting on a per acre basis is going to be $1,600 to $2,000 per acre per cut. We also know that there's going to be a mobilization fee and demobilization fee, because this is large equipment. I mean, they're taking it up the highway. It's not like they're taking this thing to 7-Eleven. And then there's lodging. Depending on how many pieces of equipment they bring, the lodging can be anywhere from 7 days to 14 days. These are all expenses the city would incur. But we don't know what those expenses are because we didn't go through with it. But then again, the most important part of this is the timing of the harvesting. We don't want a harvester coming into Ocean Shores, in the middle of August, late August. It's kind of like, I think Bruce mentioned this. He said, it's kind of like farming. I mean, the timing has to be there. I mean, you want to harvest these weeds the most opportunistic time, and at the time when the residents are get the most out of it. So we are hoping that the harvesters will be out on the canal system the end of June. So that comes July 4th, the canals are weed free. So we're in conversation with the harvesting guys right now to see if they can do that. Otherwise, they're more than willing to come earlier, but the weeds at Ocean Shore sometimes don't start growing until later in the season. So we don't want a harvester out there in the beginning or late May harvesting just water, because the weeds haven't reached the harvesting depth. So it's critical for the timing. Okay, so what do we got basically planned for the upcoming season? Again, the approach hasn't changed much. Again, the same areas have been treated in the past, and depending on the philosophy or feelings of the city, I assume there's going to be some type of treatment there next year. What the city needs to do is to keep current on new technology. There isn't any new technology that has been developed since the development of the KCM report. There are a few different herbicides, but the techniques are still the same: harvesting, autumn screening, and herbicides. The other thing we want to make sure is that we're looking at realistic and obtainable outcomes. In other words, we don't want to propose to the city, like in the KCM report, they proposed to the city that in order to remove or solve the nutrient problem, they were going to have to apply alum to the lake, or the canals and the lake. That was at a cost of about $1 million. I imagine that figure for this year, this year's dollars are probably $2.5 million. And unless we know, or unless the city has some type of funding that can sustain a $2.5 million alum project, is it really worth the time and effort to investigate it? Same thing with weed control. A lot of these are budget driven. If you've got I think this year's budget was like $60,000. So from the herbicide standpoint, I think we treated 125 acres of the lake with weeds. We treated the parrot feather. Now from a harvesting standpoint, a $60,000 budget is going to get you 30 acres of weeds harvested at once. But if that's But if the city has a much larger budget, then maybe harvesting is is a potential. So that's why this experimental project is pretty important. We want to find out exactly what the costs are associated with harvesting. So the city has some really finite details on what to expect. I think that was mentioned earlier that there's somewhat of a desire for a continued long-term budget on a yearly basis. I think since 2015, there have been funds made available. Prior to 2015, it was kind of hit and miss as to how much was available, what could or could not be treated. But I think now the group is in the right direction. More importantly is the communication. There's a lot of good communication that goes on between the Waterways Committee, the Advisory Board, the city itself, and the contractors. I mean, that's the only way this will be successful. The only way it has been successful. And again, continued involvement of the local players, which is you, the city, the residents that visit the lake. They have to be maintained and be involved within this process. And one of the things that has probably been the biggest problem, and it's not a problem because you have to understand there are a lot of moving parts here. A lot more moving parts than you would see in a normal lake because you're dealing with a canal system, weather conditions are erratic. So what we would like to see done is that historically, we can go back to the files, and I've said this before, we know that there are areas in the canals that are treated basically on a yearly basis. So I think what we would like to see is the city council make pre-approved treatment sites prior to the survey. And the survey is committed, the survey is completed, the survey results are then submitted to the advisory committee for review and approval. Meanwhile, preparations can be made for treatment. In other words, notices can be put out, all that kind of stuff can be ready to go. And then when you get final approval from the council, then we move in the full gear, full form, and go for it. But the way we've worked in the past is that we really can't get into that full mode until we get final approval from the council. And I don't know what the timeline is for council meetings, but I know for when we survey a lake, Bushy Shores was surveyed late May. I think we had the results out probably within about 2 weeks. There's a lot of data that has to be processed. So it's not like you can turn this stuff around in a day or two. It takes a while. So the data is submitted to the advisory committee. The advisory committee looks at it. Our recommendations are submitted to the advisory committee. Final decision is made. Then it goes to the council for approval. Then it's approved, and then we move forward. We want to move that process ahead by getting pre-approved sites from sites that have historically been treated. And then I think the treatment timeline can be a lot sooner because we can't send notices out. Notices are sent out 7 to 21 days prior to treatment. So if we survey the lake late May, we turn the stuff over to the advisory committee sometime in the middle of June. Advisory committee meets. They do their thing. They send it to the council. The council meets late June, early July. Then we get approval to go. And then we have to send our notice to them. So we're looking at almost like a July 15th start time, which I think is late.
That's it.
Okay, that's it. So if you got any questions,
I do. A lot of it's been talked about the treatment, and a lot of us look at it as treat it, kill it, drop it, and we're all watching. I would like some kind of a survey, some kind of survey that's been done on telling us how much water depth we're losing every year from this dropping. And I live on the canal, so I'm one of these that goes, oh, please spray, because it's needed. But I think we have to look twofold, kind of like looking at a hybrid. Maybe we need to treat, and maybe the city needs to look at investing in its own equipment and personnel to handle it.
Well, it's possible. I mean, we looked at that depth issue, and we went back to surveys that we performed 10, 12 years ago with this data. The problem is that generally what happens is when a survey is done, it's corrected according to the outflow level. In other words, if you got 6 inches of water flowing over the dam, that depth is taken off of the readings. Now, if you take a survey and there's water is 6 inches below the dam, that has to be added to the readings. And we went back, none of those corrections were ever made. So although we have a ton of data showing depths, we don't have a good way to evaluate what the depth was 12 years ago in comparison to what it is now. But it can be done, and it's something we probably should look forward to.
So I have always had the assumption that, I've always had the assumption that a good part of the algae problem, the nutrient problem, is there's a layer of muck, I've been assuming, is on the bottom. And what you're saying is that the phosphorus is not really coming from muck, the phosphorus is coming from groundwater that's flushing into the system. So I'm wrong on the muck, I'm asking.
Well, there is a percentage, and I can go through the KCM report and give you the exact percent, but I think it was like 10 or 12% of nutrients are recirculated through the system itself. So the main cause of the problem is not the nutrients in the sediments, it's the nutrients that are deposited into the water column, according to the KCM report.
Testing, can you all hear me? Okay. Is anybody aware, I don't think there is, but is there anybody here back, used to be in '05, and seen that the Fresh Waterway Corporation designed and built a harvester, and we harvested one complete season. It was built as an experiment or a starting point. We harvested with each run, actually it wasn't a run, each haul that we made was close to 400 cubic feet. And we didn't stop except to offload the 6-foot diameter by 14-foot bag of weeds, Eladia, and we opened up another bag and we kept cutting. And that bag floated free, and we had volunteers tow it back to a land spot that we had. We hauled it out, we put it on the street, the city picked it up, put it in a dump truck, and took it to the airport or wherever they take their stuff. And we harvested that entire season. And we had on there 3 cutters, the bottom 8 foot wide and 2 6-footers on each side. And we did about 112 bags, and that's about maybe 40 or 50,000 cubic feet of weeds, Eladia, and the experiment worked. We got weak spots of the harvester identified, that we ran out of operators, the people that could do the work. And we had the advantage that we owned it. We only put about 32,000 in it. We kept it here. We used it when we needed. We didn't, had its own lightweight trailer, and learned a lot of things. The harvesters are the cleanest way to clean up an area with weeds, and we can cut high or low. And we just ran out of manpower, and we just stopped because we didn't have the manpower. We identified the 3 cutters. We only had 1 powered. And we went through a solid mat of weeds. And the limiting factor was we didn't have the 2 side cutters working. And because we're trying to debug the power transfer. But I think the city could do a lot better if they open it up. Because we can trim on our time. We don't use hydraulic fluid. We used approved substitute. And 1 man runs it. And if we have a lot of weeds, we use a lot of little boats. In the
Well,
city.
I think that's basically the philosophy.
That was back in '05.
Yeah, I mean, I remember having conversations about this, and the idea of banging the weeds and having a boat pick them up, I mean, that's a great idea for the canal.
Well, we didn't bang them. We cut them. And they were trapped from the time they were cut. And we vacuumed up, we put them in a net that they couldn't get loose. And we took them ashore, and they didn't spread.
Well, I think that's something, maybe the city wants to look at again, but one of the points that you made mention was volunteers.
There's no reason why the city can't assign somebody. And then when they don't need them, you reassign them somewhere else.
Well, that's a discussion you need to have with, I guess, the advisory committee.
She's got the microphone.
Oh.
Hi, we've talked before when I had to find out where's my sign. You guys came around our area, but I got missed. So I was wondering, when you guys do this again, if you could put it into the mailbox instead of putting it,
We can't.
oh, okay. Well, then I'll just go around taking my neighbor's one and make copies and putting theirs back, because that's what I had to do. Okay, the one thing that I've noticed about our things that we have here, our equipment, the whole thing is based on one thing, the maintenance of the equipment. If we go ahead and get a new harvester, or we even maintain the one that we get, it has to be maintained, number one, and the waterways has to be put on a schedule where it's done on a routine basis. It can't be just like once every 3, 4, 5 years. It's not gonna work.
No, I mean, harvesting is, you need a schedule. It's a slow process. It does work. But when you're only harvesting, 1.5 acres a day, the question is, who's gonna have weed-free water July 4th? And who's not gonna have weed-free water July 4th? So and if you put 3 or 4 pieces of equipment out on the lake or the canals, it's probably more feasible. But 1 piece of equipment servicing the entire canal system, I just don't think would work.
In the 90s, I appreciate all the work that you've gone through, and you were very specific, and I appreciate that. But in the 90s, there was a contract or a bid that was received by Ocean Shores regarding a vacuum system that would not allow all of the cut pieces to go ahead and reroute. And it would also take a portion of the sediment, and they had a scientific idea of how far they could go with their vacuum system, and that they were going to use the airport or a portion of the airport to put those weeds to let them dry out. And I'm wondering if there was any attempt to look at that rather than harvester, because the harvester does cut and all those extra little pieces can reroute and just perpetuates the problem.
We did look at, and basically what it is a hydraulic suction hose. And we did look at it. The problem is, it's extremely slow. Probably more expensive than harvesting. In other words, we worked out on a site on Lake Washington, one property. It took a whole day for the dredge to remove the weeds just from around their dock. What happens is, you suck, a big vacuum type of suction it's almost like a gold miner's dredge. And you take all that material off the bottom, and then it gets screamed through a bucket. The water goes back into the lake, and all the weeds stay in this bucket. And then you take the bucket, put it in a bigger container, and just continue on. But it's extremely expensive, very slow. But it's a doable option. I'm not saying you can't do it.
I know that this company was based out of Canada.
What was that again?
This company that did the bid was based out of Canada.
Yeah, well, there's local companies. There's companies in Seattle that do that now. So there are a number that do it. I mean, you're looking at there aren't very many out there, because what happens is, years ago, everybody thought that you could hydraulically dredge weeds and you wouldn't need a permit. Well, that wasn't the case. You need a hydraulics permit, and you need a certified crew in order to meet the labor and industry standards. In order to meet the labor and industry standards, you need a dive master. It's almost like hiring the same type of company that would be diving to repair bridges under the water. We stopped doing it because of that. There was just too many regulations involved with it.
Thank you.
I'm confused by the term $1,600 to $2,000 per acre per cut, and it's the per cut that confuses me. So does that mean that each time the machine goes down that acre-long strip, that's one cut, and it comes back the other way, that's two cuts, so that's $4,000?
No. What that means is one complete acre cut. So in other words, once the harvester, the GPS on the harvester says, this is the area we're going to harvest, if it's an acre, that's an acre, it's $1,600. Generally what happens is that before they harvest, we would go out and we GPS the area. So we would know how large the canal is, or how large the area is that has to be harvested. And that's how they get paid.
Thank you.
Wasn't it the two cuts, wasn't the two cuts, was that we were going to do it twice in the year, once in the spring and then once in the fall, to get it accurate how the weeds were? That's, I think, is what we were referring to as the two cuts.
So it'd be, first cut would be $2,000 an acre, or $1,600 to $2,000 an acre. The second cut would also be $1,600 to $2,000 an acre.
Okay, just to wind up, very much thank you. I think one of the things that Doug hit on that I am 100% behind is to be proactive versus reactive. And I heard during the summer conversations about the delay of treating the weeds, and a lot of times we know it's coming, we just don't know when it's coming. I think there's things we can do working with the council to get ahead of it, because we know that we're going to have to treat. I mean, I think we've gone away from the days where we're not going to treat. I am 100% behind working on something with weed harvesting. I think anything you can move away from the chemicals is a good thing, but right now we're not at a position where we could move away from chemical with it. In my budget, which I think the council is not going to approve, but I put a placeholder towards a boat, which probably was mislabeled, but it was more of a down payment on a weed harvester or something to that. I know I've heard from people talk about the former weed harvester that was built by citizens of here. I know we've looked at commercial ones, and there's no way that we're gonna get it for $32,000. I mean, they're like about $500,000, the ones that we've looked at. But anyway, I am all about coming up with creative solutions. I think that the mapping of it, and even though it's not perfect, it's much better than when I first moved here, because there was a point where you couldn't even take your boat down the canal with it, and that was in the days where we don't really need to do anything, and ecology will take care of itself. Doug is right on. One of the most difficult things that we'll have to do with dealing with anything with our canals is regulations. There are so many regulations you have to go through. The things that you think that are easy are no longer easy because there are so many different agencies that are involved with it. It makes it really hard. And a lot of the rules, in my mind, this is just my mind, is it's not necessarily made for rural Washington, but they're made for downtown Seattle. But again, with the help of the Fresh Waterways, Doug Darling, your guys' involvement, that we will find a way forward. But it's not going to be easy. It's a big, big thing. But I can tell you that for the first time that we're seeing money put in from, well, if we pass a budget, from the council, money towards Fresh Waterway making a priority. So I think we're going to see some movement. I think there's going to be much more discussions about it. And I'm all about trying to come up with creative solutions, trying to find it, and to get ahead of it versus waiting and fixing it later. But it's going to take some time. So thanks, Doug.